How can nonprofits translate that insight into like practical engagement strategies?
Well, I do think certain types of nonprofits are structured in such a way that they're open to accepting volunteers, so that's fair enough. Others are not. It's just a different matter. But to the extent that your strategic plan, and all of you who are listening here should have a strategic plan for 3 or 5 years to show what you're going to do and how much it's going to cost and how much you can get from donations and how much you're going to have to fundraise and all of that stuff. Um, Finding a strategic way to think about engaging volunteers, I believe, should be part of that strategic plan. And here's the other thing, Haley, and I think this is something that you see episodically in newspapers. There'll be a situation, and I'm sure this has happened in many of the communities of the people who are listening today, where a person passes and in their will, they leave a substantial amount to a nonprofit. And the nonprofit says, but we barely knew them. Turns out that they were doing something quiet off in the corner, or they had volunteered, or they had come to an event and it moved them. And they weren't big donors during their lifetime, but they decided that as they exited this world, they were going to do this. And so this is where being conscious of the fact that even donors of modest means can, in the end, be, if not posthumously at the end of their lives, substantial donors. And you have to think about that and be open to that. And one way to do that is to have a considerate and caring volunteer program.
So I want to talk about one of the concerning stats in the study around the next generation gap. So one of the report said, while half of couples make giving decisions together, only 13% involve children or younger family members. What are we missing when we don't bring the next generation into those conversations?
And I hate to say it, Haley, but this is a very consistent finding over multiple iterations of the study. We find that people of the generation possessing the wealth do not typically involve next gen children or grandchildren in their philanthropic decisions. That's very anomalous because, again, according to our study, they tell us that they're going to leave about 80% of their dollars to their children and grandchildren. And so this amount is going to get dumped on them. This is the great intergenerational transfer without really much sense of values transmission. And it's really too bad. We at Bank of America do try when we're counseling people of means to get them to think in these terms. But it's obviously I'm not speaking of Bank of America's not being able to do this, but certainly it seems to be something that, generally speaking, in the world of financial advice, it's a real problem. And one wishes that there were a better way to think about this, but it happens to be the case and it happens to be relatively universal and it's not moving. Now, if you're thinking about how I would counsel families to do this, families of means, you have to really think about work beyond your generation. And you also, as a person who has perhaps created a company, and many of the people in our study, most of the people in our study are not heirs. They're people who have built businesses during their lifetime, so they've created that wealth. And that may be part of the issue too. They may say, well, this is something that's personal to me and I don't want somebody else to put their hands on it. But the point is they will get their hands on it through bequest or another means. And so it seems to me that the task here really is a task of discernment of intergenerational aspects. And this is something that we see in the study. We ask, we do cut the data by generation. And it's true that members of Next Gen, by which we're talking about millennials, people in their early 40s now and younger, do give at a lower rate than their elders do. And they give for different reasons. The reason they're giving at a lower rate is, as I said, because they're primarily building businesses and raising families. And they are philanthropic. They're just not quite as philanthropic. But if you think about the topics that they are interested in, and I'm going to wave my hand here so the light in my office goes back on. Here we go. If we think about the topics that Next Gen are interested in, there's some profound differences between people in the millennials and Gen Z generations and their elders.
You know, you're touching on the focus area of the next generation. And in the report, it says nearly 80% of donors are giving to causes in their own communities. So, what does that tell us about trust, connection, and local impact?
Again, this is a very consistent study, a very consistent finding in the study. Um, there is some giving out into other areas, but by and large, people are giving in their own communities. And then, as you can see, it goes out to state, to national, a small proportion to international. So, in that sense, it's actually encouraging. Again, we certainly saw this in the pandemic and afterwards, where uh, there was a huge concentration, a huge focus on giving locally because there were these existential issues that were happening with local charities. Even if they were getting PPP money or other money, they often had to close their doors, they had to have increased expenses, and so on and so forth. And so there was this leaning in to local giving. And that was consistent beforehand. It kind of zoomed up during the pandemic, but it has not really gone away. And I think that's very important for local institutions to understand that the people of means in their communities are, in fact, dedicated to the support and improvement of charities in those communities.
What do you think the future of philanthropy looks like?
That's a big topic. Um, Well, let let's take a few big themes, and I'll be very high class here, and I'll think back to the 1830s when a French nobleman named Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States from monarchical France. He was a nobleman, he was a monarchist, but he looked around and toured the eastern United States and said, wow, all the beautiful and softening and artistic things that we get from the crown, from the king, or from the church in France, here in the States, there isn't any of that. There's no established religion, there's no king. People have to do that for themselves. And so he identified from the beginning this American trend to association, which is what he called it. And from that time, even from before that time, but he put a name on it in his book called Democracy in America that he wrote that's still in print. That Tocqueville model of American society has still persisted through various iterations. And I know in the last 20, 25 years, there's been a lot of anxiety about how people don't belong to associations as much anymore and so on. You ask a question about the future of philanthropy. Philanthropy enables people to associate. It provides that commonality of purpose so that they can be together, they can do a thing in which they're committed to each other, whether it's, as I mentioned, a packathon, whether it's volunteering, or whether it's ushering in a church, or whether it's attending a concert that they've sponsored together, or whether it's helping at other types of things, a food bank and so on. These are things that we can do together that express values that in other countries around the world are typically not done by individuals. They're often done by the state. And this is what makes the United States and the model that we have here really quite unique. The nonprofit sector is a true third sector in this country, has been for a very long time now, and is part of, I'll just use the word, our DNA. So looking forward now, you ask the question, what's the future of philanthropy? I would argue the future of philanthropy is being able to find a way to continue to be responsive and flexible because the society we live in creates that philanthropy. The things that are important to the people in society are the things that will get funded, and the things where people will volunteer, and the things that people will give bequests to. And so it's not even, I mean, you could use a cheap word like relevance, but it's deeper than that. It's how people, as I said earlier, find their own values and their own deeper personalities reflected and how they can actuate on that.